everyone participating in the International Migration and Human Rights Online Forum and Workshop co-hosted by ICSC and the National Human Rights Museum. Good morning, everyone. Today, our topic is on Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation of Migrant Rights. This morning, we're very honored to have invited the ICSC Brian Patner from ICSC on methodology and practice. We'd also like to thank Perla Torres from Family Network, Director of Colibri Center for Human Rights, and also Christina Alai from Human Rights and Transitional Justice Advocate, and Father Peter Oanh, Director of Vietnamese Migrant Workers and Immigrant Officer of the Catholic Church. May I remind you all to mute yourselves, and we welcome any comments or questions to be left in the chat box. We will take them together at the end of the morning session. I now announce the beginning of today's session, and I now give the floor to our moderator. It's now your time, Braden.
So much, and thank you to the Human Rights Museum for hosting this important conversation and being a place where so many people can gather from around the world. And thank you to everybody, whether speakers or listeners today, who have chosen to join us for this conversation. Really looking forward to getting to learn from everybody who's a part of this today. As was mentioned, my name is Braden Painter. I'm the Director for Methodology and Practice at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. The coalition is a network of museums, historic sites, places of memory around the world, all of whom come together because of a belief that our historic sites have an important role to play in building more just and humane futures, and that we're better when we do this work connected to others around the world who are seeking the same things. And this conference is a great example of what happens when we can come together and try and build knowledge, build understanding, and ultimately try and impact the world around us. We're glad you joined us for this session. In this moment, we are going to take a look at a little bit about journeys and the ways we can tell stories around those journeys. From the moment someone sets off on a migration journey, from when they leave the place that they are starting, and as they travel across many different spaces, as they ultimately arrive at final destination, they face enormous difficulties and challenges, many of which are not widely known outside of folks who are closely connected to those travels. During that time, that transitional period, people easily fall prey to labor and sexual exploitation and violence, and have trouble being accepted as equals in the society they're heading to, and in many of the societies that they're passing through on their way there. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how human rights organizations can preserve memories of these experiences and present truths of these experiences through oral testimony, forensic anthropology, archiving, to support the individuals who have endured through them, families who have lost people or have been impacted in other ways, and all of the different societies that are connected to these journeys that intersect with them in some way, in the hopes that they can adopt more just practices and reforms. So to do that, we have three great panelists today, who we will say good morning, good afternoon, and good night to, because I think we manage between all three of you. The sun is up, it is early, it is rising, it is setting, it is midday for different folks. So what we'll do today is I'll give everybody an introduction to each of these really extraordinary folks that we're going to get to hear from. and then we'll dive in. So the first person we're going to hear from is Perla Torres. She is the Family Network Director at the Colibri Center for Human Rights. She's originally from Sonora and migrated to the U.S. with her family in 1999 and was raised in Tucson, Arizona. Perla earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and pre-law from the University of Arizona, where she focused on immigration law reforms and justice for migrant rights. Post-college, Perla has continued her focus on social services while working as a case manager for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, working in the reunification of unaccompanied minors in the U.S.-Mexico border with families who reside in the U.S. She continued her work as the children's specialist for the Guatemalan consulate in the Border Protection Team. Perla continues her dedication to migrant rights as Colibri's Family Network Director. She will continue a legacy of work to build solidarity, community, a movement among families who've experienced loss at the border. So we're tremendously lucky to have Perla with us. We're also going to hear from Christine Alayi, who is a human rights lawyer who has dedicated her career to promoting equality, non-discrimination, social inclusion, and access to justice for victims of human rights violations and atrocity crimes. She's led and contributed to innovative research, litigation, policy, and capacity development, and technical assistance initiatives to advance human rights and transitional justice in her native country, Kenya, South Sudan, and parts of East and Central Africa. Alayi is presently the Transitional Justice Advisor to the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. Alayi is also a co-founder of Utu Wetu Trust, Swahili for Our Dignity, Our Humanity, and probably not pronounced correctly by me, a firm that focuses on enhancing prevention and response to conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. So also just an incredibly fortunate moment for us to have Christine talking with us today. And then our last panelist will be Father Hung. And Father Hung fled Vietnam in 1979. After 36 hours of drifting on the high seas, he was rescued by a ship flying a Norwegian flag and sent to a refugee camp in Japan. During his stay in Japan, he did odd jobs like pavement and smith works and experienced discrimination, exploitation, and all kinds of unfair treatment. Having experienced all of these, he came to Taiwan and frequently witnessed new immigrants and migrant workers suffering exploitation and deception as a result of language barriers and an unfair system. He first assisted Vietnamese interns exploited and abused in factories in Taiwan, seeking justice in 1988, and established Vietnamese migrant workers in Bride's office, and later Vietnamese migrant workers in immigrants' office. In 2004, helping Vietnamese migrant workers and new immigrants seek justice through legal channels. He also works with multiple NGOs in Taiwan, holding press conferences of all sizes to seek public awareness of human rights issues of migrant workers and new immigrants. He advocates for the government to formulate more reasonable laws and policies, improving the working environment and ending human trafficking. Finally, in 2009, with efforts from all sides, Human Trafficking Prevention Act passed the third reading and was adopted. And so we are incredibly lucky to have the Father with us today. So we're excited to hear from all three of these folks. We're also excited to hear from all of the people who have joined us as well. We do have a chat box that you can use, typing in it at any time throughout. We also are fortunate enough to have a team of outstanding interpreters who are going to help us cross any language barriers that we may encounter today. So please make use of the chat box to ask questions, to share your own insights, to share resources, and to find and meet each other. We're going to hold the questions until the end when we'll have a question and answer period. But throughout, we do hope you have a conversation, right? As we think about the kind of support and impact and transformation that all three speakers are going to talk about today, that kind of transformation comes when we work together, the power that is needed for that is power we find in being connected to others. And so we hope that one of the outcomes of this session is that even just through that chat box, you will find somebody else who you want to stand with as you try and do your work, and to make it a little bit more possible for the impact that you want to see come to be. So with that, thank you again for joining us. And Perla, would you please share with us a number of your experiences?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be sharing, this virtual stage with such great speakers, and I'm here to learn as well. The presentation that I have ready for today is really to paint a picture on some things that are going on in the U.S.-Mexico border. I work for El Centro Colibri Center for Human Rights. We are located in Tucson, Arizona, and that is about 1 hour away from the border between U.S. and Mexico. So not only in relation to this presentation, this is also something that the organization hits very close to home because we are so close to the border. Usually in the initiations of this presentations, we like to do a round and have everyone speak a little bit about themselves. Obviously, because we're cut so short on time, that's something that I would love to do, but unfortunately, just given the time, we're going to try to speed through this because there is a lot of information packed into one presentation. But again, thank you. And if there's any comments, the chat box, I'll have it open along the way. Next slide, please. So the Colibri Center for Human Rights, like I mentioned before, we're located in Tucson, Arizona, about an hour away from the U.S.-Mexico border. Colibri in Spanish is hummingbird. The hummingbird has become a symbol of migration and a symbol of hope, not only within the migrant community, but also in ancient civilization was used as a way of a communicator between the dead and the living. And there's a beautiful story as to why the Colibri Center for Human Rights picked up its name, which will be described a little bit later. Next slide, please. So the Colibri Center for Human Rights, we are a non-government affiliated organization with the mission to end disappearance along the U.S.-Mexico border. So to paint a picture of what's going on, many migrants throughout their journey here to the U.S. have lost their lives crossing into the United States due to the militarization of our border. This has come at a cost to hundreds, thousands of lives from Mexican nationals and Central American nationals. We work in solidarity with the families of disappeared migrants to find truth through forensic justice, investigation, and community organizing. Colibri really stands on two pillars, one of them being the DNA and forensic, which is how we identify the people who have passed away on the southern border, whose remains are in the desert. Well, again, we'll kind of paint a picture a little bit more of what that desert looks like. And also, what is the family network, which I'm the director of, which we will, again, talk about a little bit more. But those are really the two pillars that we stand on, working together with the families who are here within the U.S., whose loved ones have passed away or whose remains are still unidentified. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here is a picture of some of the families that we serve. So not only am I honored to be able to present this information and educate those who might not know what's happening in the border, but also to share the beautiful stories of the families who we work with. These are families from all over the U.S. We have central points in Los Angeles, California, San Francisco, California, New York, and Phoenix, Arizona, where there has been a centralized amount of cases, where we have families who gather and serve as a way to collect this grief and turn it into testimony projects and into group healing. Next, please. Thank you. This really is something that we want to highlight in the duration of this presentation, is to not only understand the sides and hear the truth of the families of those who have disappeared, but also bring into consideration that this is a human rights crisis happening on our border, one that was completely preventable and unbelievably devastating to the families, but also something that we have to think back on, and also something that could have been prevented through the lack of tactics and by the government. Next slide, please. So here's a general scope of what we have seen since 1998. Over 7,000 people have lost their lives while crossing, and that is an estimated number that we get from Border Patrol. And we know to be that it is much higher than that, given the terrain and given the conditions of the desert. Many human remains will not be found. And this is a number that is reported by Border Patrol, which is not always in the best interest of Border Patrol to be summing up this amount. We know that it is to be much higher than this. Of those, at least around 3,000 have died in the southern border of Arizona, and more than 4,000 people have been reported missing to Colibri. That means that over 4,000 families have reported a loved one missing to our organization. And still there are well over 1,000 bodies recovered in Arizona, the border that in which we are so closely to here in Tucson, to Mexico and the US, that are still unidentified. And the numbers continue to grow. And that's just to show the velocity in which individuals are dying, migrating individuals are dying on our border. Next slide, please. This next slide speaks on prevention through deterrence, which was the 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan. This was something that was during the Clinton administration, was something that was put in place that stated that the Border Patrol would rely on the terrain and use the terrain to weaponize those who decide to enter into the United States by putting specific corridors in spaces where it would be more difficult for migrants to cross through. So ultimately, they used the land as a way to weaponize those who were entering into the US, to make it more difficult for them to go in through terrains such as mountain ranges or very, very hot areas in the desert where it was known that people were going to die. And as it states on the third bullet point, violence will increase as effects of strategy are felt. That means that the government was aware that this would continue and that deaths would occur. Next slide, please. This slide explains the funnel effect, which is just to complement what I had mentioned earlier, which means that these are the patterns of migrations that we have seen since 1994 and the increase of deaths in the corridors in which we have seen them. Next slide, please. This is a chart of deaths that have occurred on the US border since 1992. As you can see that there was a huge increase and spike in deaths that happened in 2010. This is one of the biggest reportings that we have seen. And these are how many agents at a time were on the ground in Arizona. Next. This is to give a visual, to really paint a picture of what our border looks like here between the US and Mexico. It's highly militarized. There was this, big expansion of the wall that happened through the Trump era, where a lot of the jargon was very anti-migrant. Next slide. This is another image of just how militarized our border is through infrared cameras, having planes and towers be presented at the border. Next slide, please. This is a quote that really sums up very well a lot of the feelings around this policy. Governments around the world know that people will die attempting to cross dangerous border regions, including deserts, rivers, and seas. Here, the conflict between human rights and migration control could not be more clear. Migrants are supposed to be deterred from crossing a border because they might die. It is impossible to protect the right of life while simultaneously attempting to deter entry by endangering it. Next slide, please. This is the number of remains that have come through Pima County Medical Examiner Office. The Pima County is the county that represents the southern border in Arizona between the US and Mexico. So this is the border that pertains to Arizona. And these are the amount of deaths and coded deaths that were found per year. So as you can see exactly how the previous chart, the more attention and boots on the ground that you would see on the desert, the more deaths increase, in this case in 2010. This past year in 2020, we saw the largest increase of migrant deaths and largest increase of reported unidentified and missing people that we have before. And that speaks volumes as to what is going on and also the gravity in which this is happening. Next slide, please. This is another visual to give example of how many deaths have been going on. This is exactly the Pima County area in which I'm talking about. Up there you can see Phoenix and Tucson. That is where we are located. And each dot represents a migrant death. And this hasn't been updated, I believe, since 2018. So there are hundreds more now. Next slide, please. So this, just now after getting a sense of that, where does Colibri and our organization come into play? We work through the DNA program to identify people and families who are missing, the Family Network, Historias y Recuerdos, and the Bring Them Back campaign. Historias y Recuerdos translates to histories and memories. So it's an audio storytelling testimony project that we have in which families can share their stories of their loved one and what's happened, and through our DNA program, identify those who have been missing. Next slide, please. So of course, this is a big project, and this is a general map of actors and people in how we work. Not only do we work alongside family and friends of those of the disappeared, but also work with forensic scientists and medical examiners who help us process the DNA of the family members and of those who are missing to collect answers for families, as well as consulates to take remains from the bodies to home countries. Next, please. This is explains a little bit of the DNA process and the reporting process in which families find themselves in once a loved one has gone missing due to migration. They have the initial contact with us in which we do an initial information report with the families. We receive dozens of calls a week from families trying to report their missing loved ones. So the initial phone call from families is very important. Then we do a non-genetic information initial comparison from our database to the database of the Pima County Medical Forensic Office. From then, if we believe that the case can process to be a DNA case, we travel to collect DNA sample from relatives for those who are missing on the border. From then, we submit to the lab, and from then we get a DNA result. Usually takes between 6 months to a year to hopefully do a comparison result from the lab to see if the DNA from the families match those of remains found in the Pima County Medical Forensic Office. This is where consulates are involved to then later retrieve the body to home country. Next slide. There are several people who do identifications and do this type of work. CODIS is the general national DNA database who collects about 3.3 identifications a year, EAF, who it does something similar to what we do in Mexico, and I believe it is currently in New York, do about 5.2 identifications a year, which us, a very small nonprofit, we are ranging about 13 identifications a year, most of them being through DNA and forensic work. We are and this speaks volumes considering that we are a very small organization. We are a staff of 3 full-time women who do this. So it's a very big project for such a little team. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to get a little bit into the testimony and speaking on behalf of families who are disappeared. This says, El no saber nos está matando. The not knowing is killing us. And this is a 2 family members looking for their loved one. On the right, you see Daniel Perez Romero and her sister, Magdalena, who live in the Bay Area, California. And Biden Venegas Flores, which is mother Mirna, who also live in California. Both of these young men migrated to the US, one from Honduras and one from Mexico, and tragically lost their lives. Next slide, please. This is Marco Antonio and his mother. Marco Antonio lost his life at 32 years old from Mexico, coming to the US. His mother lives here in Tucson, Arizona. His case took about 3 years after DNA was taken to be identified. Next slide. Another example have been Felix and Romero. They are siblings, and Felix's DNA was taken and was quickly found. And this was a blind match identification that Colibri was able to do, given that Romero's body was found in conditions where he could be identified by his tattoo, which just gives to the DNA technology or the forensic technology that's available in the Pima County Medical Examiner. Next slide. This is Yadira Carrillo and Jose Carrillo, twin siblings who are still unidentified, who became missing in early 2001. The mother of the siblings has lost 2 children and now has 2 children unidentified. Next. This is a photograph of a protest that was done in Denver, Colorado. Family members attending a protest to call on behalf of legal action to change some of the laws that have been in place and that have caused so many to die and be separated from their families. Next slide, please. This is another photograph of Marco Antonio and his mother that we saw before, Camerina Santa Cruz. Next. This is a photograph of a vigil that was taking place in New York. There are many vigils that we do across the US to honor these families and also bring together a community of those families who have lost a loved one. Next slide, please. This is from the same vigil that was held as well. I believe there are several pictures of this, if I'm not mistaken. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bring Them Back campaign, as well as the Historias y Recuerdos, which is a testimony project that we have that it will be later turned into a podcast, which is a beautiful testimony from the families that explains and really brings to life who their loved one was and really honors them in a way that is very beautiful, and also in hopes to educate people about what's going on in our southern border. Next slide, please. And this is another visual that we had done with families. Families usually, when we get together for visuals, they'll put pictures of their family members, bring flowers, and there's always a sign that says, "Los seguimos buscando, siempre presentes." And it means we keep searching, always present. Next slide, please. And that is the end of the presentation. I know it was a little quick and it's a lot to process, especially talking on family testimony and also talking on behalf of what's going on. And my contact information is there if you all have any questions aside from the ones that we'll do later.
Thank you, Perla. That's really great information. And we also appreciate, we know you had to be off camera, though you would like to have been on camera as we fight the internet around the world. Such good information and really different ways that you all have made impact there, though they all knit together really, really powerfully. Christine, would you like to start adding something additional to this conversation for us?
Braden, thank you so much. And what a fascinating presentation by Paula. Very interesting work from the organization. I would like to thank the Site of Conscience and the Taiwan Museum for Human Rights for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Connecting from many miles away in a different continent. I think it's quite exciting that technology allows us to do this. And thank you also for the opportunity for us to come together from different disciplines, all working toward a common vision from different approaches. I have been introduced already, so I'll not get into that. And as we go along, I will speak a little bit about my experiences in Kenya and in South Sudan. So we could go to the first slide. I'm focusing this presentation on gender justice, and a lot of it will speak to the experiences of survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict contexts in Kenya and in South Sudan. Now, in both of these contexts, the starting premise is that even prior to an episode of conflict, we already have existing sociocultural norms that define how men and women relate in society, children as well, and the types of different things that men and women symbolize to their society, different roles and responsibilities that are ascribed to them, and beliefs and practices that are associated with these roles and responsibility. Therefore, when a conflict context emerges, whether it's one of civil strife, such as election-related violence that was experienced in Kenya, or one of armed conflict, as what we have been experiencing in South Sudan, sexual and gender-based violence often occurs in relation to the continuum of those existing beliefs and norms, or sometimes to disrupt those gender-based norms. And in the form of disruption, what we see is that oftentimes those norms and beliefs are used to break down a certain community, terrorize them, humiliate them, or new tactics are deployed which go against the norm that certain communities have known in the past. So you'll find, for example, community members describing that in the context of conflict, you have sexual violence against children, for instance, which is an abomination during ordinary times, or against elderly people, or you have an increase in genital mutilation, forced circumcision, amongst other forms of sexual and gender-based violence that are often not that common during peace times. Now, because of existing gender-based norms, beliefs, and practices, men, women, boys, girls, as well as sexual minority groups will experience conflicts in very different ways. And I'll give specific examples that describe this reality as we go along. So we find that sexual and gender-based violence is very rampant, but men, women, boys and girls also experience other forms of violations in very different ways. So, for example, when we think about the South Sudan context, where in the context of conflict, there are multiple or numerous incidents of abductions of children who are forced to join military forces. You also have quite a rampant abduction of older male adults who are also forced to join armed forces. You have enforced disappearances, and obviously displacement as well of communities who are targeted to other neighboring countries in Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, mostly. But we also find that there are evolving roles for men and women in the context of the conflict. Whereas ordinarily we may assume that men are the most common combatants, we find that women are also involved in combat. We also have changing sides. When one time you may have a community as the victim, but another side as the perpetrator in the context of revenge attacks. But also we find that assumption that women, for example, will often be just the victims or bystanders has actually been that myth has been confronted in many of these contexts where we find that even women hold political status and have an active agency within their communities during these times. And finally, those gender-based norms also affect how men, women, and girls experience the aftermath of the conflict and the violations that are related to it. And just to describe this, displacement offers a clear depiction of this reality. In our experience here in South Sudan, we find that majority of the refugee populations in the neighboring countries are women and children. And they will often describe to you that while they fled, their spouses or partners were left in country to continue in combat or to pursue livelihoods in order to be able to support them in foreign countries. And so we find that women and children bear the brunt of violations that are experienced during flight, as well as continued violations, including sexual exploitation, when they get to foreign countries to be able to access basic needs such as water, food, healthcare, and protection for their children. But we also find that men and women will experience the socioeconomic consequences differently based on beliefs and norms. Because, for instance, men are known, or in many communities, I'll speak about Kenya and South Sudan that I'm more familiar with, men are considered to be the breadwinners. And so you imagine what happens when there's a breakdown in this structure with women having to take on that responsibility, as well as the physical and psychological effects. When we speak to survivors of male survivors of sexual violence versus female survivors of sexual violence, whereas they both experience very strong stigma, the stigmatization that women describe to us and the psychological trauma that comes with it is mostly because of the victim shaming and victim blaming of how they're perceived to be impure or to have dishonored their communities because of the violations experienced. But men on the other side describe to us that their stigma and trauma is because they feel that they have been feminized. They feel that as a result of being raped, they have now taken on the role or taken on being a woman as opposed to being a man, which presents very diverse ways in which men and women experience the consequences of the same violation. I'll move on quickly to the next slide. So with this in mind, considering that we're coming from a pre-existing cultural context of specific gender-based beliefs, sometimes stereotypes, that then affect how men, women, children, and sexual minority groups experience sexual and gender-based violence. Those same beliefs are then carried into the post-conflict context, where in many instances, societies begin to find ways and means to address the legacy of human rights violations that are associated with conflict. And from the experiences in Kenya and in South Sudan, what we find is that those gender-based beliefs affect how visible or hidden sexual and gender-based violations are within this context of pursuing transitional justice measures to deal with the legacy of human rights violations. And so we find that, for instance, torture, killings, disappearances, displacement are more accepted, are more manifest as violations that need to be addressed in this context. But because of the stereotypes associated with sexual and gender-based violations, and because of the barriers that victims face as a result of those stereotypes, sexual and gender-based violence often is hidden because survivors are fearful of coming forward, or it's suppressed because society does not consider them to be as a matter of priority or as important as these other forms of violations. Or oftentimes we even find that survivors' experiences are contested. This context also begins to raise questions about who should be qualified or who should be perceived to be a victim, both by law or through administrative practices that are set up by the different mechanisms looking for measures to address the human rights violations, or even by society. And I'll give an example here where victims who have been raped and conceived children as a result of that rape ask the question, is my child conceived as a result of this rape a victim? And many times we find that society may describe these children as secondary victims, but in reality, they themselves face their own forms of violations that are varied from their mother, including neglect, ostracization, assault from their communities by virtue of how they were born. Those same gender-based beliefs and stereotypes also affect who sits on the table, who is considered to have an influential voice or a representative voice for their people, to determine the types of peace and transitional justice processes that need to be considered. And oftentimes, because of discriminatory beliefs that suppress women's participation in all processes, even prior to conflict, we find that women's representation is either very minimal or missing altogether. Same beliefs and stereotypes also affect the choice and design of transitional justice mechanisms. If those violations are hidden, suppressed, or contested, in many instances, the likelihood is they do not form part of the mandate of transitional justice mechanisms that are set up. And finally, those beliefs, particularly where there's gender blindness, also affect the nature of remedies that eventually result from transitional justice mechanisms. And therefore, you can imagine that the history, the experiences during and after the conflict of these category of survivors could easily go unreported for decades to come. Next slide. Oh, that's quite tiny, but I'll try to speak to each point. So, in many contexts, different societies will choose different approaches to recover the truth about experiences of affected communities in the context of conflict or civil strife. One of the most common mechanisms that have been adopted are truth commissions. But we also have various other forms of similar processes of truth recovery, such as commissions of inquiries, community-driven truth-seeking and reconciliation processes, as well as processes that are geared towards pursuing accountability in legal form, both within the country that is affected or outside the country, as well as reparation programs that seek to understand the consequences arising from victims' experiences. I participated very intimately in the Kenyan Truth Commission that was set up after we experienced massive violence following an election for a period of 3 months between 2007 and 2008. And presently, with the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, the role of the Commission is to collect and preserve evidence of human rights violations and international crimes committed in the context of armed conflict from 2013 to 2018. But even as we continue with our work here in South Sudan, there are areas that continue to experience this armed conflict. So from these experiences, maybe just to summarize how the process runs, Truth Commissions, as well as the Commission, let me speak about the Kenyan Truth Commission. The model that is used involves, in the first instance, conducting research that helped the Commission to identify the specific violations and the forms of harm that they needed to address. This was followed by direct statement taking with the various communities that were affected. And here, victims had to share the experiences that were then documented, either in statements or in memoranda that were presented to the Commission. The third phase involved public hearings with the affected communities and selected testimonies by different communities to share their experiences with the public. Finally, the Commission prepared a report, which is included in 4 different volumes, has been archived and published. Unfortunately, implementation is yet to come. With the Commission of Inquiry in South Sudan, we collect statements from victims who have been affected by different forms of violations. We preserve their witness testimonies in anticipation of accountability processes that have been provided by the peace agreement, including a hybrid court, a commission for truth, reconciliation and healing, and a compensation and reparation authority, which are anticipated to be established quite soon. Now, out of these experiences, what we have seen, and from global, similar global experiences world over, is that this becomes the first opportunity when survivors of sexual violence are able to come forward, share their experiences. And therefore, these processes can help to unearth and to publicize their experiences, but not just the experiences, also the causes, what context existed that permitted these violations to take place against them. What were the various patterns of those violations, and what have been the consequences of the violations? These processes also help to clarify contested and hidden truth about gendered experiences, especially for marginalized groups. And it also helps to depict the varied roles that women and other minority groups have played, as we discussed earlier. But most importantly, these processes are very powerful because they challenge the status quo. Because victims are placed at the center, it provides an opportunity to acknowledge survivors, acknowledge the experiences they have been through, acknowledge them as rights holders through their participation and agency. These mechanisms also help because of being victim-centered, properly understand and identify appropriate measures for the types of remedies and reforms that are required. But most critically, speaking about the Kenyan Truth Commission that was concluded in 2013, the government has failed to implement it to date. The value of the report is one of long-term utility. Survivors and civil society organizations have continuously referred back to the truth that is documented in this report for their continuous advocacy. But the report also serves as a continued source of memorialization to keep the stories and experiences of survivors alive and their continued demand for reparation and accountability. But most importantly, the value of these processes is that they begin to catalyze a process of transformation in society, where we begin to question our practices that lead to sexual and gender-based violence, change our attitudes, and hopefully get to a place where we espouse equality and inclusivity. And final slide as I conclude. But in order to be able to achieve this, final slide, please. Such truth-telling and documentation exercises must be very deliberate about adopting a gender-inclusive and gender-sensitive approach in identifying and narrating and documenting the experiences of survivors. We spoke about the structural context within which violations occur, and the same structural context continuing to exist even in the post-conflict context. And therefore, it becomes particularly critical to be able to address the barriers that victims and survivors face. And numerous. And I think the one that is most critical is the social stigma that is associated with SGBV, being able to address the barrier of laws, for instance, that penalize sexual orientation or the existence of sexual minority groups makes it very difficult for them to come forward. But even when we think about refugees who are displaced due to the conflict, their status either as registered or unregistered makes it very difficult, especially when they're unregistered, to be able to come forward to access services. But there's also the issue of language barriers. Survivors in South Sudanese refugees in Uganda, for instance, told us that they find it very difficult to access services because they do not speak the local language, and in many instances are unable to get interpreters. Besides that, as these mechanisms get into doing their work, they have to be able to identify and mitigate conscious and unconscious biases. Some conscious biases, for example, deal with the assumption that victims should, of their own volition, be able to come forward and proactively narrate their experiences. But because of the social stigma and the other barriers that we have talked about, we must be able to put in place deliberate and proactive mechanisms to reach out to survivor groups in order for them to be able to engage with these processes. We've also made assumptions about the likelihood of male victims of sexual and gender-based violence. The data that is emerging from different contexts around the world now shows us that whereas we have continuously had data that depicts that women are disproportionately affected by conflict-related sexual violence, men are similarly highly affected by conflict-related sexual violence. But the kind of barriers they face are unique because of the roles and the stereotypes and beliefs that are held about masculinity. And therefore, this requires specific and different measures to be able to address their needs. And similarly, for LGBTIQ, their barriers are distinct and specific mechanisms are required for them to be able to come forward. And finally, other biases that we have are about how survivors will present, that perhaps they must be crying and emotionally traumatized, whereas you'll have other survivors who barely show any type of emotion. Coming towards the end, these mechanisms to work, therefore, they must deliberately incorporate policies and practices that ensure that inclusivity and sensitivity is adopted in the design and operation of the mechanisms. We must be conscious about intersectionality between gender and other identities that may create even higher barriers for survivors to come forward, such as race, class, level of literacy, disabilities. These are all factors that will affect men, women, and children differently. And finally, this endeavor requires that sufficient resources and capacity are available, both technically as well as financially. And with all the infrastructure that is required, timelines, a conducive environment to be able to engage with survivors, but most critically, partnerships between these mechanisms and community organizations that have already built trust relationships with victims that become the interface for the more administrative programs to be successful. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to sharing more insights and learning from you as we get into the plenary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine, for a really insightful look at some theories, some policies, some structures, and some really human experiences, all of that. Thank you for shedding that light on all of this and bringing those voices in. Just as a reminder to everyone, after our third presenter, we're going to have a chance for discussion. So go ahead and start putting any questions, any ideas or focuses that you'd like us to address during that time in the chat while we listen to our last presenter. And so for our third view, Father Huang, would you come on and add a final piece to this conversation today?
Greeting to you all. Thank you, Brandon. And thank you to panelists for you have just shared very moving and very insightful information. The topic that I'm going to share with you today is basing on the records that we are having now, discover the human rights violations to migrant workers here in Taiwan, and what do we do about that with those records? Next slide, please. So I would like to make a very brief introduction about my office here. This office is established in the year of 2004. And we have shelters, and we have sheltered thousands and thousands of victims of human trafficking and labor exploitation and sexual exploitation here in Taiwan. And what we have done is to offer direct assistance to migrant workers whose rights have been violated, and then by sheltering them and helping them to access to legal assistance while they are in the shelter, and after they leave the shelter, if the case is still continuing on. The second part of the work we do here is to lobby the government and to work with other NGOs to formulate new laws to respond to the needs, to respond to the violation of human rights of migrant workers in these countries. And the next one is to promote knowledge regarding what has happened to migrant workers and also new immigrants here in these countries. At the same time, we hope to raise awareness in the community and also in Taiwan society, so that the human rights of migrant workers as well as the new immigrants need to be respected. Next slide, please. So as you see that a picture of myself standing in front of one of the Taiwan government department, and we at that time we gathered together and we together with others nationalities, Indonesian, Thais, Vietnamese, to demand for the equal treatment, equal pay between migrant workers as well as local workers. Next slide, please. And the two pictures there, we also gather in the Taiwan Legislative Yuan to asking also for the government to investigate the relationship between officials and brokers system here in Taiwan that have exploited so many migrant workers and new immigrants in these countries. And the second picture on the right hand side is about you're going to see that the women sitting in front of the pictures, all of them were workers working in nursing home, and these women was identified as human trafficking victims because adding on other reasons together, they worked 30 days a month, no days off, continuously. Next slide, please. So, sharing with you a few images that we have done here in Taiwan to let you know that what we have been doing here is just to fight to fight for justice, and then the system is the government. Okay, the system is the government. However, the governments in Taiwan, because Taiwan is a democratic society, is a democratic, politically democratically elected governments. Therefore, the violation of human rights to migrant workers and new immigrants is I use the word beyond politics, meaning that something happened before under the, for example, the KMT governments, that now is under the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party. However, what has happened before have to be accountable for and responsible for now. And I have used a quote that I collected from the United Nations Office of High Commissioners, Center for Economic and Social Rights, and the title of the article is that who will be accountable, human rights and the post-2015 development agenda. And it says something like accountability from a human rights perspective refers to the relationship of government policymakers and other duty barriers to the rights holders affected by their decisions and actions. So by looking at this definition, I for myself will come back to this to talk about the corrective function and preventive function of accountability regarding sexual exploitation and labor exploitation in the next slides. Next slide, please. So, in order to fight for the right, and you can see that there are two pictures. The first picture is taken in the legislative conference room, and we have a public hearing regarding a broker system here in Taiwan have made these migrant workers coming from the 4 countries, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines, become the victim of the debt bondage, and we want them to change it. We want the government of Taiwan to look at that and then to change it. And on the second picture, on the right, you see that all these women, they are the victims of debt bondage. However, and from then until now, in Taiwan, this matter has not yet been resolved. It's still there. Next slide, please. So I now would like you to share with you the two very big issues here in these countries. So the first one is the sexual exploitation. Next slide, please. So here I wrote the word 90s, but actually it happened in the year of 2004. And until now, what is it? What has happened? More than 100 Vietnamese young and middle-aged women was sexually attacked, sexually exploited for the consecutively for 3 years by a broker company's owners and his fathers, and as well as with the compliance, with complicity of the office of the Vietnamese governments that supposed to be look after these women. So early 2000, I heard about. Sorry, next slide, please. So as you see that the picture, there are two pictures there. The picture on the left is the broker, and his name in Mandarin, in Chinese, is Hong Mingyu. And on the picture on the right, you see the arrow setting on an old man standing there. That is his father. Now the father owned a farm, and the son owns a broker. So the owner of the broker continuously within 3 years to transport all victims to work as illegal work in this farm, and then to let this man, his father, to sexually abuse them. And according to the victims, there were other people as well. Now, when I heard about this, so I went down to a city called Tainan. That's the southern part of Taiwan. And why I heard about this? It is because one morning, a lady called me on the phone and asked me that a Vietnamese young lady in the police station wanted to talk with me. And then I listened to the woman, and as soon as she heard my voice, she continuously cried non-stop. And when I talk about this, I'm still moved by that moment. And then I let her finish her crying, and I asked her what happened. And she said that she was repatriated to Vietnam by the broker, Mr. Hong Mingyu. And then I said to him, why were you repatriated? And she said that because she did not allow Mr. Hong Mingyu to rape her again. And then after that, she cried again. And then I asked her about the case, about her story, and she told me the story that I have heard previously, but none of the victims came and talked to me because they are afraid of being repatriated. And then at that time, I traveled to Tainan City, and then I met her, and then she helped me to contact other women. The majority of them were still in Taiwan. However, 1/3 of the victims already been repatriated back to Vietnam. And through contacts of herself and others, I was able to connect to all of them, actually. And then while I was doing the connection, and then I listened to her story, and this is the way that the perpetrator treated them. As soon as these workers arrived in Taiwan, the broker, would take these women to his home. And then he let them there for about from 3 to 7 days. And during this time, he would pray on them, meaning that he observed, and then after that, after that, after 3 to 7 days, the broker sent these women to their employers. And then after 1 month in Taiwan, you suppose everybody, every migrant workers coming to Taiwan to work have to go for health check. And then he would take these women to his broker home again, and there he raped them. He raped them. Before he raped them, he, psychologically speaking, talked to them that if they tell anybody, and then they will be repatriated to Vietnam. Repatriation means these women will lose everything: reputations, money, family. Why? Because before these women, they live in the rural area, and before they left for Taiwan, they were celebrated. The whole village celebrated, because it's it's kind of honor for a person leaving a village to go to work overseas. Okay. Now when they return, meaning that they haven't accomplished their mission, and then the village, the people in the village will look down on them. Now about loss, about financial loss, all of them have to deposit their land to the bank to borrow the money in order to come to Taiwan. A lot of money. At that time, $5,000, $6,000 US. And then the broker using this kind of psychological way to protect himself. And then each victims have to write, "I agree for you to rape me." And the court, actually the judge also obtained that information. So, and then this case, at that time I was very lucky, because the Legal Aid Foundation in Taiwan established, and I was able to access to that legal aid helps. And then we had 2 lawyers to deal with this case, and this case taking about 10 years to finish. And then when the broker were indicted for imprisonment of 20 years, however, they could not find him. He escaped to mainland China. Okay, next slide, please. So together with sexual exploitation, there is the labor exploitation, and that I call that the labor debt bondage, because of each person coming to Taiwan, they have to pay a lot of money. At that time, 5, 6, 7, or even people $8,000 US. So they have to work without expenses in Taiwan for more than about nearly 2 years. They pay back the debt, and then they borrow again, and they pay, and they again, and they pay it again. So next slide, please. This is the picture you see on the left and the right. Is a group of the Vietnamese men who were supposed to work in the factories, and now they were taken to a place in the rural area and do handiwork. Next slide, please. And you see that the picture on the left and the right, that is a place where they work, where they live. Okay. Next slide, please. And labor exploitation also happened to women who work in the nursing home. Next slide, please. Okay, and you see that these women, their place of living is on the floor, and this is only one woman I just showed you in the picture. She worked as a carer. Next picture, please. As a cook. As a carer. Next picture, please. Okay, so a person who worked all kind of good job, and then not having permission to go out, stay in that stay in that nursing home, and for their rest, they're supposed to rest at from 12 to 1, but they have to stay where they are. So these women, they work non-stop. Okay, this is another form of labor exploitation in Taiwan. Next slide, please. So, as I said before that, accountability and responsibility. Until now, these cases have not, even though it's been prosecuted in courts. However, in Taiwan, in education and even in the legal aspects, even the examination yuan, I talk about this to directors, and they don't know anything about this. So next slide, please. So these are the documents in my office that thousands and thousands and thousands of cases that we have kept here in my office. And I hope that talking about accountability and responsibility, I would like to, for me, these documents are the evidence of human violation of human rights here in Taiwan, and then Taiwan younger generations and in the education needs to know about this and need to study and need to do research about this. Therefore, we're talking about accountability. We're talking about what these injustice have to be addressed. Okay, and then the pain and then the suffering of these people have to be also heard by the people of Taiwan. I'm talking about the prevention function of the accountability. I'm talking about that the policy at that time, why it allowed such a thing happen here in Taiwan. However, I think that these two functions of accountability here in Taiwan are not yet dealt with. So that I hope that by looking into these cases, then the human rights and respects in Taiwan will be observed, and then will be followed, and the rights of migrant workers and immigrants here in this country will be respected when these cases been studied and researched systematically. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you all. Yeah, this was a deep and powerful set of stories that you told, and I think really brought together a number of the larger points that had already been shared in a very concrete and moving and affecting way. So thank you for sharing those and for the larger work that you're doing. So we've got a little bit of time for questions here at the end. We've certainly been given quite a bit to dive into from our panelists. And I see there's one question in the chat already. Thank you so much for adding that there. As others are starting to write questions and sort of some of the ideas and thoughts that are on your mind, I wonder if we might start in part where Father Huang was just leaving us off, and thinking about how there's this need for the larger storytelling, the larger narrative change that each of you has talked about. But simultaneously, there's often this very direct need for services of all kinds. And so I wonder how you balance some of the larger sort of social and cultural work that you've talked about doing with that pressing need for direct services simultaneously. And that's a question that could go to any of the panelists who would want to speak to that.
I could speak a little about that because it's something that we grapple with quite a bit when it comes to particularly state-established mechanisms such as commissions or, for instance, the UN Commission of Inquiry, where the mandate of the body that is inquiring is very limited to seeking the evidence or the truth or the testimony from survivors who present with a myriad of needs that the mandate of the body itself may not be able to offer. What has worked very well in these instances is collaboration with organizations and partners who themselves are already offering some form of services. And this requires a cross-sectoral collaboration that not only focuses on one aspect, but is able to provide a referral mechanism that can offer clinical care, can offer psychological care, socioeconomic assistance where that is required by survivors. I'll give an example of a very recent mission that we conducted in Uganda in collaboration with an organization known as Refugee Law Project. And through that collaboration, we were able to meet survivors of sexual and gender-based violence that live within refugee settlements after displacement from South Sudan into Uganda, who for many years, since the conflict had broken out in 2013 and their displacement during various episodes, had been unable to disclose any of their experiences to anybody until the Refugee Law Project initiated an assistance project. Through this assistance project, they use various approaches. And the first is outreach to refugee communities very broadly, where they say, we're offering medical assistance to those who might have injuries resulting from the war and that have not been treated, to those who may have psychological trauma, and so on. And after that outreach, they then delve into a screening process. And that screening process serves not only to identify the type of medical or psychological needs the survivors might have, but also becomes a critical point of actually providing a space for disclosure for many of the survivors of sexual violence. And then beyond that, they then work with a coalition of service providers, including partnerships with the local health facilities and a dedicated team within those health facilities who are then able to process and work with the survivors over time, so that it's not a one-time intervention, but they can continuously come back for what they need. On the other hand, the Refugee Law Project maintains the connection as the facilitator, the various levels of service. And what this has helped to do is we met, for example, 2 male survivors who did not disclose their experiences of sexual violence until almost 5 or 6 times of going back to the health facility. And so through the collaboration that offers the types of services needed, it serves not only to give care and an ecosystem that supports the survivors, but also an opportunity for continuous testimony sharing and documentation that supports the truth recovery process. So partnerships, cross-sectoral linkages are extremely critical. Yep.
Thank you. That's such a detailed and nuanced answer. That's fantastic. And I think really resonates with some of the ways that Perla was talking before about the necessity of collaboration and kind of building this network of people who are responding in any moment. So really, really thoughtful. There was a specific question for Father Huang. You really moved somebody, Helen, in the audience to be sad and angry and wanting to take action about the situations you were describing. Would you be willing to add in the chat some links or contact information for people who wanted to get involved directly, or ways to follow that conversation up? And then while you're adding those in the chat, if you would, there was a second question that was originally came in for Christine, but I wonder if Perla, you might speak to it first. And it's about that it can be hard to have testimonies from victims, in this case of victims of sexual violence, but I might expand that a little bit and say, right, a number of the experiences that people go through. How do you think about starting to connect with people and start to hear testimonies and help people give testimony and about painful and difficult and traumatic experiences? And then Christine, if you want to share briefly too, please do.
Yeah, of course. First and foremost, there's a lot of trust that's built between the families that we work with and the networks that we built in Colibri. So there's already a trust established for several years, especially when you're doing DNA collection. And really at the core and at any fundamental level, Colibri really strives to put the families first and center in a lot of things that we do. So that trust is already established. Of course, it doesn't go over our head that this is, especially in telling testimony and sharing experiences in this way, it could be really re-traumatizing to the families. And the type of loss that is being experienced by families who have a disappeared loved one is ambiguous loss. So this thought or this cycle of unresolved grief or frozen grief is really something that we see present in the families and the family network and those who are giving testimony. So it's not only a combination of understanding our position when we ask for testimony, but it's also, it really has to come from the family's ability to, or want to share the story of their loved one. And many times because the families feel silenced by not being able to do their own search alongside the border, many of them are unable to, given their status in the country, that this for them is a form of searching. So it's a mix of understanding and also making the families aware of each family has their own reason for providing their testimony. And I think that there's a lot of power within that, especially when families decide to share and we're listening back to the audios. But I think more than, on top of everything, first and foremost, I think it's the trust that's built by Colibri and the families.
Okay. Thank you. And knowing that there's a lot more to say about all of these, right? There's other good questions coming in about how to try and start countering the pressure. I have dozens of questions, but I believe we are coming to the end of our time, and we just want to be respectful of all the rest of the time that the rest of people's days. And so maybe we could just go around briefly. Each of you is a great depth of wisdom and perspective on this. Are there any last brief thoughts that you would want to leave everybody with? Maybe Father Huang, we can start with you. Any closing thoughts for people?
Thank you very much, Brandon. I hope that such a forum like this will inspire Taiwan government, and I think that because creating this platform is from Human Rights Museum, and I hope that Human Rights Museum will continue to work with NGO like us to collate all information of violation of human rights to migrant workers and new immigrants, and then that would be a good solid foundation for study and research that would help change the attitudes and the way that migrant workers and new immigrants been treated here in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Christine?
So much. This has been a very interesting session, learning, and I'm really excited and thankful to learn from the experiences of my co-panelists. I think I just want to end by sharing that from what we have seen world over, truth-telling having survivors narrate and document their experiences and preservation of those stories is the strongest pillar for accountability and change world over, because justice and recognition takes many years to come. And so those stories, documentation and preserving those stories becomes the surest and strongest pillar that confirms that one day, one time, and over time, we could achieve the transformation that we're looking for. So thank you so much, and I look forward to engaging more in future.
Thank you as well. And Perla, yeah.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. I agree. The ones closest to the issue, and that's the beauty of testimony and documentation and preserving these stories, that those closest to the issues have the best way to gear us towards the solution. And by being able to give those the microphone and the platform and bringing them to the table and having conversations like this is a way forward, and has been also just one of the most beautiful ways. I mean, I'm honored every day to do what I do and to be able to be embraced by the people that we work with.
So thank you to all three of you, right? For Christine for getting up early, for Perla for staying up late, for Father Huang for taking time out of a very busy workday for you. And then with that time for sharing with us both such insightful kind of structural and stepped back perspective, along with some of the really powerful stories grounded in the human experiences that we're trying to shift and shape and learn from here. So thank you all. You've given us so much to think about, and we could barely get into it. I hope this conversation is one that continues to move forward amongst everybody who's been a part of it today, all the folks who joined. Thank you for being here, for your attention and the thoughts that you're having during this, for the questions that you shared, and for the work that you're doing and will do around this as well. I hope you find something in this, and more importantly, someone in this session that you can take with you as you try to build community where you are, make those connections, build the kind of collaboration that people were talking about to shift the perceptions, the individual lives, and the larger policies that all of our panelists reference. So with that, thank you as well to the Human Rights Museum for hosting us, and back to you all if you have any closing notes for this session.
Thank you, Braden, for moderating this very important session. And I would like to thank the three speakers for bringing us these really inspiring and poignant experiences in your human rights works. Thank you all for your participation, especially considering the fact that it wasn't very easy putting this forum together. And our three speakers are crossing 3 different time zones, having staying up late or getting up really early. I would like to thank all of you from the bottom of our hearts. And I hope that in the future, we will be able to continue more discussions and exchanges on human rights issues and our works. And we look forward to learning more from all of you, the ways, the mechanisms that you have in responding to human rights issues. And the Human Rights Museum here in Taiwan will hope to use our own influence to make more changes in the future. And I now announce the end of the morning session. This forum will begin at 1:30 in the afternoon, and we welcome all of you to join us in the afternoon. Thank you very much. Have a good day.